de qui ça, bon Dieu n'a qu'à faire. Ooh, oh yeah, oh yeah, 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 oh, oh. Ooh, quand t'as pour moi même pas de balle, non, avec Jésus non m'a pensé. C'est pour la vie me faire gros et pas. Au nom de Jésus, faut me camper. C'est pour me témoigner, pour m'étonner, pour me pas jouer un mot, pour m'exprimer. Alléluia, la c'est pour me crier, l'aime gars gros, bon Dieu moi. Yeah. Avec Jésus dans ma pensée. C'est pour la vie me faire gros et pas. Au nom de Jésus, faut me camper. C'est pour me témoigner, pour m'étonner, pour me pas jouer mot, pour m'exprimer. Alléluia, la c'est pour me crier, l'aime gars grosse, bon Dieu moi.
Now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Then, being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth, to devour her child as soon as it was born.
A woman, a child, and a dragon. At first glance, this might sound like the ingredients for a frightening fairy tale. In fact, the troubling scenes that you just witnessed are part of a true and powerful prophecy given to the Apostle John nearly 2,000 years ago. What does this prophecy found in Revelation 12 tell us? Does it point to some event that happened thousands of years ago? Or does it describe things that are going to take place in the near future? And who do the woman, the dragon, and the child represent? Join us now as we journey deep into a world that few have ever seen, but all are a part of. Revelation, the bride, the beast, and Babylon. In the last book of the Bible, Revelation, the Apostle John was shown a vision of a great struggle between good and evil, a prophecy of a battle that has been raging behind the scenes since the dawn of time. The secrets behind this prophecy have been shrouded in mystery for centuries, until now. From the kingdoms and the rulers that have fallen around the world, to the men and women that stood up to fight for what they believed in, this is the story of Christianity, the search for truth, and the foundation for the faith of billions.
Now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Then, being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth, to devour her child as soon as it was born.
Many Bible scholars and historians have studied this prophecy over the years and agree that the prophecy of Revelation 12 points to an event known as the Massacre of the Innocents, which occurred in first century Judea.
In the decades leading up to the birth of Christ, the Roman Empire had conquered the whole Mediterranean world, including Judea. 20 years before Jesus was born, you have King Herod, a client king for Rome. We have documents about him outside the Bible that tell us that he was very cruel, he was ruthless, and you wouldn't want to get on his bad side.
Herod was very anxious when a small delegation of wise men from the east came to Jerusalem announcing their search for the newborn king of the Jews.
Why would Herod be upset about that? Because that was Herod's title, as bestowed upon him by the Roman Empire, King of the Jews.
He finds out from the Pharisees and the Sadducees exactly where this child is to be born. And he finds out it's Bethlehem. And so he has such anger against this child, he sends in the soldiers to try and kill Jesus.
The Bible tells us this barbaric act was inspired by more than just the tyrannical jealousy of an old king. Many Bible scholars believe that it's part of a much bigger struggle that has spanned the ages and is still happening today. To uncover the secrets of this prophecy, we're going to first need to identify the main characters: the woman, the child, and the dragon. Let's take a closer look at the woman. We know that she's a symbol of someone or something. Does the Bible tell us what this woman represents?
Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her.
Very clearly, a woman in Scripture represents the church. You have a woman as representative of God's people. We see this in the Old Testament, we see it in the New Testament. Jesus comes from the people of Israel, and then the church grows up as something that Jesus develops.
Most importantly, this woman is about to give birth to a special male child. Who is the child?
We have a couple of indications. One, he rules with a rod of iron over the nations. That's a reference to the Old Testament, where clearly God is the one ruling over the nations with a rod of iron. And then he says he's caught up into heaven. So these two indications pretty definitively tell us that this is Jesus.
Now let's consider the arch-villain in this important prophecy, the dragon.
And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon.
You know, I wish I could just give you a fanciful theory here, but the Bible tells us who the dragon is. The dragon is the devil.
So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him.
What we see here in the first part of Revelation 12 is a symbolic portrayal of the age-old conflict between Christ and Satan. All through the life and ministry of Christ, Satan tried to disrupt Jesus' plans to provide salvation for humanity.
But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed.
They tried to silence him. They tortured him to death publicly.
But Satan's scheme to derail the plan of salvation was utterly shattered when Jesus rose from the dead.
And her child was caught up to God and his throne.
With the Son of God now physically beyond his reach, the devil directed all of his fury at the followers of Jesus, the new Christians. He did much of this through the cruel power of imperial Rome.
Now when the dragon saw that he had been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child.
Christianity was a struggling, small, persecuted minority that didn't have official status in the Roman Empire, and there were a series of persecutions, some of which were quite severe.
One of the roles of religion in the Roman Empire was to ensure the well-being of the state. The idea was if the gods were worshipped properly, then they would favor the empire, and if they were worshipped improperly, then they would, bad things would happen to the empire as a result of divine wrath.
They do not want to sacrifice to the gods, and the gods at that point include the emperor.
So it's easy to consider these people religious scapegoats. Basically, if something's going wrong, probably it's because there are Christians around who are refusing to give the gods their proper due. Christians are progressively stripped of their civil offices, their military offices, their books are confiscated, their churches are destroyed, they're forbidden to meet, and so on, all because there's an anxiety that this is really undermining the welfare of the empire.
As the early church suffered under this withering persecution of Rome, their lives became a powerful testimony for truth. While the pagans lived in constant superstitious fear, these Christians faced torture and death with a supernatural peace.
Basically what Nero did was he fed them to the lions, he had them tied to pillars, he put pitch on them, and then he set them on fire as human torches so they could have the festivities continue on into the night.
Being stretched, pulled into two, being killed by gladiators.
Just about every creative way that you can dispose of Christians.
When facing the painful end of their lives, they often sang and rejoiced. As thousands of Christians paid the ultimate price for their faith, their dying prayers and blood essentially became seed for the new church.
People are so enthralled by how these Christians are dying that immediately, the reaction is, sign me up.
And so the Christians spread like wildfire. The more you killed them, the more they stood for their faith.
Now, it is true, and I think it has to be emphasized, that the early church spreads despite the very concerted attempts at repression of extremely autocratic and powerful emperors who set themselves very firmly against the Christians, and yet the early church survives.
Tertullian argues, whenever something goes wrong, whenever there's a famine, or whenever there's an illness, a pestilence that sweeps through, everybody says, the Christians to the lion. And then he says snidely, as if so many could be fed to so few. And his point is that you can't destroy us all.
During this time of exponential growth, Christians all across the Roman Empire quite literally went underground. This labyrinth of tunnels and chambers beneath the Roman cities became known as the catacombs.
Now, the catacombs are important to understand. First, many people imagine that there are caves naturally under Rome, and the Christians simply went into them. The catacombs, almost without exception, are not natural caves. They were excavated by the Christians.
Sometimes services would be held there, in the very tombs of the martyrs.
The second point is the very act of burying your dead is hugely significant. Christians believe in a resurrection of the body. Now, of course, that belief has shifted and changed over the centuries, but from all we understand, early Christians believed that they would be resurrected in that actual bodily form, and therefore they chose to bury their dead, not to cremate them. Therefore, if you are seen to be burying your dead, especially at times when there are intense waves of persecution, you're more or less saying to the police, come and investigate me, I may well be a Christian.
In AD 306, a new Roman emperor came into power, and things began to rapidly change. Constantine the Great was a capable military leader and a shrewd politician.
So Constantine had to fight a series of civil wars in order to achieve his political aim of becoming emperor. And that's his own personal and political aim. It's got nothing to do with Christianity. He goes down from Gaul, modern-day France, where his power base was, to confront his rival Maxentius in Italy.
As he was marching with his army, he had a dream one night where God came to him and told him, you will become a Christian and put this sign on your shield, and you will conquer. Shortly after that, he actually had a vision, which history tells us was seen by his army as well as by Constantine himself.
He looked up to the sun, and he saw a cross of light above it, and the Greek words, en tou Nikeia, by this conquer.
The story that he had had this dream does appear at a relatively early stage. It's described by Eusebius. There are different sources, there are different versions, but it does seem that Constantine does say, I've had this divine encounter, and an angel has told me that in the sign of the cross I will conquer.
Constantine commanded his troops to adorn their shields with the Christian symbol.
His opponent moves across the river at the Milvian Bridge, has Constantine and his army in front of him, the river and the city behind him. Not a great situation to be in. So if you do not beat the oncoming army, you have nowhere to retreat. So he loses.
So for Constantine, who is certainly not yet a Christian, this is a powerful thing, because he himself believes the Christian God has given me victory. So if you're a pagan, or just somebody who's confused about religion, you've had here this clash of deities. And who's emerged on top? The Christian God. You can draw your own conclusions.
Gradually, the national sentiment against Christianity began reversing. During Constantine's reign, Christians went from being a persecuted sect to openly holding positions of influence in the courts and palaces of kings and governors.
So a large part of the elites used to running the show automatically then become also the local bishops, etc. You know, become Christian. It wasn't such a big leap because most of them anyway believed in one supreme divine being which had different representations.
If you want to advance in the army or in the imperial civil service, there's every incentive to become a Christian because all the people at the top are Christians.
It becomes very attractive because Constantine's Edict of Toleration makes it so.
Constantine can rightfully claim the title of great, for he turned the history of the world into a new course and made Christianity, which until then had suffered bloody persecution, the religion of the state.
And so, as people from around the Roman Empire entered the Christian church, they brought with them many of their former pagan beliefs and practices.
Now the percentage of Christians in this top 10, 15, 25% increases, and it increases dramatically in the top 1-2%. That's the real change. That is when Christianity really becomes the Christianity that it is today. Because now the people who've been running the show, they are now Christian.
Over time, church leaders began to embrace the regal robes and flamboyant ceremony that was part of the pagan religions. And in place of the simple commands of God, they began to teach superstitions and man-made traditions. Now, instead of the Christian church converting the heathen world, the pagans were converting the church.
There's a train coming out of the first century represented by the documents we have in the New Testament that demonstrate kind of the shape of the church there, going into this long dark tunnel of the 2nd through 4th centuries, and then coming out in the 4th century of this long dark tunnel. And the train of the church that comes out is so different than the train of the church that goes in. You say, what happened?
In AD 391, by the order of Emperor Theodosius I, Christianity became the official state religion of Rome. Worship at pagan temples was outlawed, and all other religious practices ceased.
You're trying to Christianize an empire. You're trying to Christianize a pagan culture. The old basilicas were basically pagan temples. Put a cross over it. Put in paintings of biblical scenes, biblical heroes and saints and martyrs.
So Christians actually deliberately at times and purposefully, as a strategy, take pagan not only places but rituals or ideas and, as they think, subvert them to advance the cause of, spreading Christianity. What we don't know is the extent to which they think this through and say, well, at what point is it legitimate to do this, and at what point do we perhaps begin to be taking on other ideas?
The speed with which the early church tobogganed into apostasy will take your breath away.
As millions of pagans hastily joined the church, they were naturally reluctant to dispose of their idol treasures. The Romans and the Greeks were so used to being surrounded by symbols of their deities. They began doing the same thing with Christianity. So many of these new converts just relabeled their idols with Christian names, like Paul, Mary, and Peter.
A statue of Jupiter became a statue of Peter.
And we know that because it has a sun disk right over its head that indicates that this is not Peter, but it's a pagan statue that's been renamed.
The representations of Isis, which is originally an Egyptian goddess but has become very Greek already, becomes essentially the representation of Mary carrying her child.
You have a mother and child tradition all the way down through history. You have it in Mithraism, you have it in Babylon, you have it all the way back in Persia.
It appears that Mary acquired some of the characteristics that were associated with some of these other goddesses.
She wears a dark blue coat and she stands on the half moon. She is the mother of all gods. Isis carrying her son Horus. That is the image that gets a new name, and now the name is Mary carrying the child Jesus.
Or a depiction of the god Hermes is shown as Christ the Good Shepherd.
Soon the statues of the saints and even Jesus began adorning the churches. Even though God clearly forbids this practice in the Ten Commandments, people continued to revere and to pray to these relabeled idols.
Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them.
Related to the last point is the veneration of Mary, the mother of Jesus. While it is true, Mary was a faithful woman and greatly honored to be his mother, the scriptures teach nowhere that she's to be deified or worshipped.
Mary had always been important in ancient Christian history, but over the Middle Ages she becomes elevated almost to looking at it detachedly, almost to the rank of a semi-deity.
The Virgin Mary was believed to be the one who would speak up for guilty human beings to her supremely virtuous and judgmental and rather censorious son. It's a very strange image, but that's how the religious art of the period shows it.
The Bible does not venerate Mary as a special saint. It lifts her up as a pure, wonderful woman used by God to give birth to the Messiah.
Yet, At the Council of Nicaea in 325, the Church elevated Mary to the stature of a goddess and co-mediator with Christ. Even as early as the late 4th century, churches were being dedicated to the Virgin Mary. But sadly, these were not the only errors that slipped in during this time. During the Apostolic Age, baptism was a sacred ceremony reserved only for those old enough to make a rational decision for Christ. It was a public testimony of accepting Christ and His forgiveness. Baptism literally represents being dead and buried to our old life and being resurrected or born again to a new life in Christ. The baptism ceremony was also performed in a lake or a river where a person could be fully submerged, signifying they were fully washed from their sins. The practice of baptism was gradually altered by the Church. Hundreds of years after Christ, sprinkling and pouring was introduced as a more convenient mode of baptism. This actually undermined the powerful symbolism of the service, and it contradicts the example of Jesus, who was baptized by immersion.
There was this unbiblical concept that a child could sin right away, and so therefore if he sinned, he was in danger of going to hell and burning forever in hell. So the only way to take care of him was to baptize him. And he had to be baptized into the church. If you weren't a member of the church, it was tickets for you.
So theologians say, you know what, we need to start baptizing babies immediately, as soon as possible after they're born, so that in case they die, and of course this is a period when infant mortality is high and a lot of babies do die, they can get into heaven.
Another Christian truth that was altered by pagan influence was the Lord's Supper. Jesus instituted the communion service, also known by some as the Eucharist, to be a beautiful yet simple ceremony where His followers would drink unfermented wine and eat unleavened bread. These symbols of Jesus' sinless body and blood are designed to help believers remember the sacrifice and the teachings of Christ.
By far the most important rite for late medieval Christians was the Eucharist or communion, or as they most commonly called it, the Mass.
Men and women all come together and take the sacrament. They celebrate what we would call communion, taking the body and blood of Jesus Christ.
But again, under the influence of heathen rituals, the Holy Communion service was gradually changed by church leaders into a mystical ceremony. In this new ritual, fermented wine was used, and the priest, allegedly, had the power to transform the bread and the wine into the actual body and blood of Christ.
This is transubstantiation, the notion that a priest transforms the Eucharist into the body and blood of Christ through the pronunciation of the formula Hoc Essenum Corpus Meum, this is my body.
They were powerful words believed to have the property that when they were uttered, God transformed the nature of the bread and the wine into the body and blood of the risen Jesus Christ.
Even to the point where later on they say, we are creating God by speaking the words of mystagogy.
Essentially, what happened on the altar was that bread became body, wine became blood, but they just still looked like bread and wine.
This offering of the sacrifice in the Eucharist, this sacrifice of praise, this communal meal, now becomes not a remembrance of the sacrifice, but a sacrifice in of itself, and is giving salvation.
By 1415 AD, at the Council of Constance, church leaders further decreed that only the priests could drink the wine and the laity would only receive the bread. Yet the Bible clearly says that when Jesus established the communion service, they all drank from it. About 300 years after Christ, the church began to deviate from another of the 10 commandments, specifically the 4th commandment that requires believers to remember the 7th day as the Sabbath.
Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God.
When the Jews kept fighting against Rome, what had been kind of an umbrella of safety under Judaism becomes a lightning rod to Christianity.
The Christians become alienated from the Jews. Jews persecuted them, and so they're trying to distance themselves from the Jews.
Church leaders began to devalue the seventh-day Sabbath of the Ten Commandments in preference for the more popular Roman Sunday.
Some Christians mistakenly thought that you should fast on the Sabbath, but you could feast on Sunday. That's what the pagans did. They feasted on Sunday, fasted on Saturday. Not a Jewish concept. The Jews fasted Friday and feasted Sabbath. But that's how some Christians thought of it. So if you're fasting on one day and you're feasting on the next, you can guess which day becomes the more popular day.
And Christ is resurrected on a Sunday, and there's a very natural tendency, therefore, to mark that and celebrate that.
There's a third reason, and that is the influence of sun worship that creeps into the church. And when sun worship begins to creep into the church, Constantine can make use of that to lead to the exaltation of Sunday, the day of the sun, as being the day that people should worship on.
This gradual departure from God's law over the centuries has become so widely accepted that most are shocked to learn that Sunday keeping has no foundation in the Bible. In AD 313, Constantine published the Edict of Milan, establishing Sunday as a day of rest. The emperor's Sunday law had nothing to do with Christianity. It was actually to honor the main Greco-Roman sun god called Helios, or Apollo.
The Emperor Constantine became a convert to Christianity, and also because he remained partial to the sun god, the Emperor Constantine moved the day of worship from Saturday, the Sabbath, as had been traditional in Judaism, obviously, to Sunday, the day of the sun god. And ever since, Christian folks, at least for the most part, overwhelmingly, have held their day of worship on Sunday rather than Saturday.
This is clear from another edict of Constantine given in AD 321, when the emperor ordered,
"On the venerable day of the sun, let the magistrates and people residing in cities rest, and let all workshops be closed."
Notice, the edict uses the word sun, S-U-N. It's also recorded that Constantine the Great made a law for the whole empire that Sunday should be kept as a day of rest. Obviously, this change did not infiltrate the church overnight. History tells us that for decades, the seventh-day Sabbath, together with Sunday, were both observed as holy days.
The very, very early church clearly is still worshipping on the Jewish Saturday in the times of the apostles. But by the mid to late 3rd century, that has largely been abandoned or is in the process of being abandoned. By the early 4th century, in many parts of the Roman world, Christians are generally worshipping on Sunday.
It's during the time of Constantine in which the idea of transferring the solemnity of the Sabbath to Sunday is first expressed.
Centuries earlier, the prophet Daniel had foretold a religious power would arise that would think to change times and laws. Within the Ten Commandments, there's only one law that is also a time: the Sabbath. The doctrine of hellfire was also distorted by pagan mythology. In the book of Revelation, the Bible teaches that following the Great Judgment Day, the lost will be cast into a lake of fire. At that time, each person is punished according to what they deserve, and then they're totally consumed and eternally perish.
And do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. For the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing.
The priests began to teach that hell was a place of eternal torment, ruled by the devil, and it began at the moment of death. The fallen church was able to use this frightful concept of never-ending torture to terrorize and manipulate both the king and the commoner. Most tragic of all, this false teaching portrays Jesus as some sort of sadistic fiend. Another pagan concept that infiltrated Christian thinking was regarding the afterlife. Purgatory is the idea that teaches that at death, Some people will enter a temporary hellfire where they're purified for heaven.
Purgatory is a halfway house, halfway kind of between heaven and hell. And the thing with purgatory is you can escape from it.
The church develops gradually, and again it grows on the church by slow degrees. The idea that anyone who dies with their works of satisfaction incomplete will probably have to pay them off in some place of post-mortem suffering. They are suffering in order to be purified, purged from their sins and offenses which they've committed in life.
Many people misunderstand purgatory and hell. There's an idea you can get out of hell. You can't. If you go to hell, that's it. There's no release. You're very, very wicked, and you're just doomed. But most people, we have a lot of bad things. So how can we be made good for heaven? We have to have it purged out of us, and thus you get the word purgatory. Therefore, most Christians believe that their relatives are suffering in purgatory. And purgatory is not a nice place.
The idea of purgatory dates back centuries before Jesus' time. Writings from Plato, as early as 400 BC, helped shed light on where this concept of purification and punishment came from. However, purgatory didn't become regarded as an actual place until centuries later. Between 1160 and 1180 AD, theologians developed the doctrine of purgatory, leading to the formal acceptance of it at the Second Council of Lyon in 1274.
The Church then offers to support the dead in purgatory by its prayers and by attributing to people the benefits of the sacraments, especially the communion. This is all perfectly orthodox. The Church believes that this is doing good, and lay people seem to be willing to put large amounts of money into it. And you have an extraordinary proliferation of institutions founded principally for priests to say masses for the souls of the departed, particularly in the 14th and 15th centuries.
This doctrine was fabricated to manipulate the masses for financial gain. People were willing to pay huge amounts of money to release a loved one from the tortures of purgatory. Of course, believers could never really be sure when someone left purgatory, so the money kept flowing into the pockets of corrupt priests.
The head of the church would have people going out to raise money and encourage people to give their money to the church, buy people out of purgatory, so they could fund these elaborate buildings.
This belief in purgatory is also built on the dangerous concept that the works and the prayers of the living can somehow alter the destiny of the dead. Yet Jesus made it very clear there is no limbo or purgatory. After death, a person's next conscious thought was the resurrection and their eternal reward.
Do not marvel at this, for the hour is coming in which all who are in the graves will hear his voice and come forth. Those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of condemnation.
Central in the gospel message is the teaching of how we obtain forgiveness. This was another major Bible truth that suffered during this age of compromise. It was taught that if a person wished to be forgiven, he or she must first confess their sins through a priest, through a rite called the Sacrament of Penance, more commonly known as confession.
So in order to make up for our insufficient goodness and our actual wrong actions, we must all, lay people as well as clergy, we must all confess our sins at least once a year, and preferably more often than that, to a priest.
The priest grants the words of assurance that the sin is absolved. It's gone. But a person, because they have violated the laws of the church and the teachings of Christ, has to perform a work of satisfaction in order to make up for the fact that they have sinned.
This was a negative development on several counts. First of all, it's taught nowhere in the Bible. Secondly, it puts a mortal man in the place of Christ, and it made God seem detached from the average person. Of course, at the time, It also placed the priest in an awkward position to hear about all the wicked deeds of his parishioners. The Bible teaches that mankind is helpless to save himself. This is why Jesus came to this world. The Scriptures teach that salvation depends entirely upon our trusting God for mercy and grace, that we don't deserve it. It's a magnificent gift that can never be earned by our efforts or good works. Even obedience comes through a gift of grace. The New Testament doctrine of salvation by faith is widely taught and understood today. But during the darkness of the Middle Ages, it was easier to convince the illiterate masses that they needed to perform good deeds in order to earn God's favor. The people were taught that if a sinner was to have any hope of appeasing God, he or she would need to pay huge sums of money, perform painful acts of penance, or make some weary pilgrimage. This would often include an assignment to recite certain prayers over and over as a requirement to obtain forgiveness. In the heathen religions of the world, the idea of repetitive prayers or chants was nothing new. It was believed that you could appease or influence the gods by constant echoing of prayers or by using special magical words. Jesus clearly warned against this form of prayer.
And when you pray, do not use vain repetitions as the heathen do, for they think that they will be heard for their many words.
Corrupt church leaders knew in order to maintain any lasting power over God's people, they would need to separate them from the one thing that they knew could expose these deceptions: the Holy Scriptures.
The Bible was not initially withheld from the people. It was accessible. But in time, when people saw differences, they challenged the clergy. And so it was in their interest over time not to make available the Bible to the people.
So from the 5th century to the 15th century, 1,000 years of history, it was taught and accepted that only religious leaders were qualified enough to explain the sacred texts. The common man was told he could never hope to understand the Scriptures without the assistance of a priest. With this lethal deception, the church laity was kept in darkness. Meanwhile, the visible church, once a biblical bastion of truth, had degraded into a corrupt political organization trimmed with spiritualistic ceremonies. It's no wonder that this time period of cultural, economic, and spiritual deterioration is known as the Dark Ages. It's tragic how in just a few short centuries, the wonderful light that had been blazing from the luminous bride of Christ had been eclipsed by pagan traditions. Now, a very different kind of woman emerged to take her place.
And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations, and the filthiness of her fornication. And on her forehead a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and the abominations of the earth. I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement.
In Revelation chapter 17, John sees a woman who he describes as strikingly different from the pure woman of Revelation 12. Who is this new bloodthirsty harlot? And what about the bizarre beast that she's riding? If you're not sitting down, this might be the time to do so. You may find what you're about to hear a bit shocking. There's only one empire, one church, one institution that matches the criteria in this prophecy: the Roman Catholic Church. This does not mean that all the people within this faith are bad, insincere, or lost. The Catholic people are among the most kind and have accomplished a phenomenal amount of good throughout history. This is really about a bigger struggle between spiritual powers and institutions battling over the truth of Scripture. But now we need to pull back the veil and really take a hard look at the facts. In Revelation 17:1, we observe this harlot woman sits on many waters. Fortunately, the angel explains the meaning of this symbol for us in verse 15.
Then he said to me, the waters which you saw, where the harlot sits, are peoples,